we need to change something. We need to a little bit more tactics. We need to an idea how we play, because this is the real problem for me.
Fedor wanted change, right?
He did.
And the change came today with Bob Bradley being fired as sporting director and head coach of Toronto FC. And then, of course, later on the day, Canada Soccer gets back in the news. Jason DeVos talking to TSN and Rick Westhead all about the issues, the awful position Canada Soccer's in financially. So there's so much to get to football-wise on this day. So let's bring in a man that knows more than most, and that is TFCRepublic.ca's John Molinaro. JMO, I guess when it rains, it pours. Let's start with the Bob Bradley news. 2 wins in 17 games. Not good enough. Not a huge surprise that a coach gets fired with this kind of record. Overall, you look at his tenure, and all you can say was it was a huge failure. What went wrong?
Well, I mean, where do we begin? I think it has to be fair to Bob, it has to be said. I mean, he inherited a team that was in a bit of a state of chaos when he took over, right? I mean, the team was coming off the back of a disastrous, campaign under Chris Armas and then Javier Perez. The DP situation was a mess with Josie Altidore and his situation. So there was some other sort of poor contracts that he had to get out from under. So he wasn't dealt, an ideal hand to begin with. That said, I think there were a lot of missteps by Bob Bradley and to an extent also, Bill Manning, the club's president. I think you look at this off season and how they rebuilt the roster. And I think that's what I would point to. They brought in players like Adama Diomande and Victor Vasquez, guys who were in their 30s, and they've been a complete bust. They have barely played because of injury issues. Then, with Diomande was supposed to be the number 9 who was going to play between Bernardeschi and Insigne, and that didn't sort of pan out. And then to sort of compensate for them, he makes the trade with Nashville to bring in CJ Sapong, who, a veteran striker who I would suggest his best days are behind him. There was a lot of focus on sort of the starting 11 this offseason. Obviously, they wanted to sort of strengthen the starting lineup. And when I spoke to Bill Manning back in March or April, he said, that was intentional. They wanted to sort of really focus on the first 11 and that they would worry about strengthening, the bench and their depth, as the season progressed. I think that was a poor strategy. I mean, I get the idea, but I understand them wanting to strengthen the starting 11, but I don't think it couldn't have been at the expense of, addressing the team's overall depth. They have too many players wrapped up on TAM deals and on big number sort of contracts that it hasn't given them much flexibility. And, I think that's been one of the major issues this year. To say nothing of the fact, look, again, to be fair to Bob, they've been absolutely brutalized by injuries this year. They had 11 players absent, 11 on the game on New England. 4 of those were for national team duty, but I don't know any team in the world that could survive, losing players, at the rate that TFC has done this year. So it's been a bit of bad luck, but also I think a lot of just poor sort of team management. And I think too, Bob's tactical approach was rather predictable, right? I mean, I don't think he was able to get the best out of Bernardeschi and Insigne. The team has only scored 19 goals in 20 games this year. He seemed to be intent on playing them in those sort of wide positions out in the front 3. Although the last 2 games he's played them more centrally, and I think Insigne has looked a little bit better. But it just simply wasn't able to get the best out of this team. They just seemed to be stuck in a rut where they played decently. They weren't really badly outplayed in any games this year, but just couldn't put in a complete 90-minute performance under Bob Bradley.
John, you mentioned Bob Bradley's lack of tactical adjustments, putting his 2 best players in their best positions. Did that by chance sour the relationship with those 2 superstars as his tenure progressed with Toronto FC?
I don't know if I don't know that sort of specifically led to the breakdown in the relationship between the DPs and Bob Bradley. I think it just had more to do with the fact that bluntly they didn't sort of have much respect for Bradley's tactical acumen and his standing in the game. Even though this is a coach who played in or coached in Norway and coached the Egyptian national team and coached in France, and coached in the English Premier League, there seemed to be a genuine distrust of Bradley and his tactics and sort of his management style. And I think that had more to do with sort of the breakdown in the relationship between Bernardeschi and Insigne, between them and Bradley, more than, how they were deployed, although I'm sure that didn't help matters either.
Bill Manning will talk tomorrow, I believe, to the press, and you mentioned him, and it's a good point. Since he took over, I mentioned it in the last couple of years, it hasn't been great with DPs, players, coaches, controversies, not great at all. So a lot of pressure on him right now. But also, let's go back to those Italians, Insigne and Bernardeschi, great players. We know how good they are. They should be among the best players in the league. They should be dominating on a regular basis. They haven't done, regardless of who the coach is. Moving forward, it's on them, isn't it now? They'll get a replacement for Bob Bradley. In the interim, of course, it's Terry Dunfield. But now it's up to those players to show who they are and what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's make no mistake about it, and let's be perfectly clear. They pushed for this. Like, they wanted Bob Bradley out. So they got their wish. And you're absolutely right, James. Now they have to sort of start to live up to the expectations and their big money contracts, because frankly, they haven't done so thus far, during their time in Toronto. I think, as I noted earlier, I think Insigne has improved in the last couple of games. He's looked pretty sharp. But, Bernardeschi hasn't scored for, I think it's 14 goals in all competitions. Hasn't scored since April 1st. Was clearly, not at his best on Saturday in the loss against New England. These are big name players, James. These are, European champions who were, 2 years, whatever it is, removed from winning a European championship with Italy. Guys who play at the highest level, in the Champions League and in Serie A with teams like Napoli and Juventus. The expectation when they come to MLS and came to Toronto was that they were going to lift Toronto FC out of the doldrums to the next level. And I think those expectations were people were right to have those expectations, but it hasn't panned out that way. And, I get it that the relationship with Bob Bradley broke down and there wasn't much respect there, but at the same time, you have to be professional and go about and do your job. And, I don't think they've been anywhere near close to what they should be during their time in Toronto so far.
Unfortunately, the negative news has to continue in this country soccer-wise. Jason DeVos came out and kind of laid out the grim financial state of Canada soccer. John, what did you make of the news that came out today regarding both the men's and the women's national team and the funding for them?
Well, the timing of it is what kind of struck me, right? I mean, I don't think it's any sort of secret that, Canada soccer is having financial difficulties. I think this is kind of like the dirty little secret that most of us who've covered the sport in this country have known about for a long time. But I think the timing of the story coming out today was what I found most interesting, because, we're talking about a men's team who is set to compete at a Gold Cup, women's team who is set to compete at a Women's World Cup. They're both still without a collective bargaining agreement. They're both sort of trying to negotiate labor peace. So I think it was in part directed at them in terms of the labor sort of negotiations about, possibly sending a message to the players that they have to temper their expectations in terms of, financial rewards and what they can expect from Canada soccer going forward. But I also think it's a clear shot across the bow at Canada soccer business, because, they are, whether right or wrong, they're being blamed in part for, the financial dire situation that Canada soccer finds itself in, because the way it's being portrayed is that the CSB deal is, crippling to a certain extent Canada soccer. So I think this was a shot at them in terms of, look, you've talked about renegotiating the deal and modernizing it. Let's get it done. Like, we need this help right away. So I think it was a very deliberate, in terms of the timing. I think it was quite deliberate on Canada Soccer's part to come out and kind of, publicly talk about this, at this particular juncture.
Very telling when Jason DeVos, the interim general secretary, uses the word bankruptcy and says, listen, we're not considering it per se right now, but we're doing our due diligence into what that might look like for Canada. When you hear that word used, you know what the CSB is thinking. You know what the players should be thinking. If that's reported, they have an offer on the table for 80% of the funds going to them. That's a strong word to use from Jason DeVos. That wasn't off the cuff. That was planned, was it not?
Yeah, well, absolutely. As I said, I mean, I think that's part of the whole sort of sending a message both to the players and CSB. I think it was very deliberate in terms of the language that it was used. And I'm not sort of throwing shade at Jason. I mean, he's general secretary. He's got to do what he's got to do. But I think that was a very sort of deliberate and pointed comment by him. And I think his choice of the words, talking about bankruptcy were very deliberate. So just from a negotiating perspective, I mean, I think it's a pretty shrewd move, because I think it's fair to say that, when we're talking about this situation in terms of, the court of public appeal, I think people are pretty much been on the player side, right? I think Canada Soccer has been sort of portrayed as, the villainous dolts who have been mismanaging, the finances for years. So I think this was in part to sort of redress that balance and maybe change the narrative a bit, and, put the players and CSB on the defensive a little bit.
JMO, it's never dull. We've covered this game for a long time in this country. There's always something going on. Just a year ago, we're celebrating a wonderful time and the future is bright. And here we are now. The world's crashing down. Hopefully, we'll get it sorted out. As always, mate, thank you so much. We'll chat to you soon, hopefully.
Sounds good, Jarms.
That's John Molinaro of TFC Republic.ca.